Hello, this is Blair Stanislao with the Happy Lion Center. Welcome to our podcast, Mystical and Infamous, where we have playful and easy conversations about anything mystical, getting to the heart of all things strange and weird. Join us in a bit of magical tomfoolery, spreading the alchemy of love and light. And now, we invite you to enjoy the show.
My great passion right now is how to actually create truly connected relationships. Because I think deep down, we all really desire love, but love not in a way that our parents and our grandparents knew, but in a way that we deeply know. Like we want to be seen, we want to be loved, we want to be deeply connected with people, but we really struggle. And so I was at a friend of mine's who she paints these beautiful paintings, and she's been channeling this work for 30 years. She's in her late 80s. She's the most interesting woman in the world. And I went to see some of her latest work, and she had this beautiful square painting. I went to see her last weekend, and she had painted this square painting, and in the center was this tree, like a tree of life. And there was an angelic being on each side, and the title was something like, I wish I remember exactly, but I think it was Peace in Duality. And I realized that this is one of the foundational challenges we have. So we have this facilitator training right now running about the divine union of the masculine and feminine. And it's such an interesting discussion amongst everybody, how actually difficult it is to find peace and duality in many of our relationships, especially the ones that we love the most, that we're most connected in. And I realized, I was just awestruck by this picture, this painting that she had made, because it was like, because of millennia of struggle, conflict is all we've actually experienced. And even in loving relationship, there's still some distance. I was raised by wonderful people. I was raised by Ward and June Cleaver. I wasn't raised in a difficult home at all. And yet you couldn't show all of you because that would be too much. And you didn't want to do anything that was weird because that would be too much. That would cause conflict. So I was actually raised to never create conflict. We were raised to be people pleasers. We were raised to be codependent. We were raised to never cause any problem so that we would always have this peace within duality. But it wasn't authentic. And so this is a huge thing for me, because I believe that peace and duality is what we're meant to have, but we're coming from this conflict in duality. And so afterwards, we were about 12 of us that had gone to see the work, and we were sitting, and I asked the woman who paints them, I said, you always talk about the journey from 3D to 5D, and she has all these paintings depicting that. And in the center, there's this 4D. And I said, what exactly is 4D? Like, what is this 4D that nobody talks about? And she said, I don't know, because she just paints whatever comes. She's just channeling. Mm-hmm. And then my friend, who's a medical intuitive, she said, well, in ray analysis, the fourth ray is harmony in conflict. And what I wonder about right now is that the transition between this conflict in duality and peace in duality, that we actually have to expect some kind of conflict. But our journey as a soul, or as souls, is to actually find harmony within the conflict. And in that way, then we'll actually develop whatever philosophies and skills and emotional intelligence that we need to actually live in peace and duality.
So what's really interesting to me is that you started with art, visual art. And the reason, well, I have a background in that, right? And when I got this degree, the thing that I learned really, really well was that you learn to speak about what you're observing, because you're critiquing art, you're looking at art itself. So you're trying to think about it, you're supposed to feel through it all. There's, all these things that you get to do with it. But one of the hardest things that I noticed, the people who don't have experience with that don't easily do, is to talk about something in a way that we would say is objective. I mean, nothing's truly objective, right? But so what that means in the art realm is you'd say there's a circle in the top right corner that is, and then they would describe it. Okay. So the other, and what that does is it actually does sort of what we do when we're, meditating, is it really makes you pull back and say, because you have to communicate with somebody in a way that they can understand where you're looking before you even start talking about it. It causes you to kind of pull back from the artwork and step back and think about how you feel about it or what you think about it or what have you. And so we use these terms. So there's elements and principles of design, which are like color, shape, form, and then there's things like rhythm, balance, that kind of thing. So you use those terms when you're talking about artwork. And one of those things is contrast. And I'm sure many people are familiar with the channeler the entity Abraham Hicks, channeled by Esther Hicks. And she uses that term contrast. And I just adore it because I was trying to learn about photography. I was young and I just went off with a photographer one time and he was doing a wedding. And he asked me a question. I think it was like 20-ish. And he says, how would you get a picture of this wedding cake to look really good? And I don't remember what his question was, but the answer was contrast. The thing was that it's this white cake that has white decoration on it, and you can see it with the naked eye. But to make it stand out in a photo, you have to have contrast. So in images we create, we usually make them a little more dramatic so we can see them better. So given that, and the concept of duality, which is contrast, right? But the key is that you're talking about is that harmony with that experience, which of course is it seems to be the real humdinger, if you will, about existing in this world and like making a major shift from coming from this place of total consumption in the world that you live in, and in the sense that you are just experiencing it, you're going through reactive, that kind of thing, versus seeing both sides or seeing at least more than one perspective and being able to understand that and be at peace with either one. So that's what you're referring to. But here's the funny thing about visual art. I know this for certain, and it actually works in all different realms too, is that if you give somebody a blank canvas, so that could be like, you write any kind of book you want, you can live anywhere you want to live, whatever it is, it's a blank canvas, and you give them no direction. There's no contrast. There's no restriction. Most of the time, people don't do well at constructing something. They don't do well at the experience of it. They get overwhelmed. Their mind has difficulty like focusing on one thing or another. So what that contrast does is it says, okay, I can't do these things. So that means what can I do? Right? And the same thing applies here, is that the really unique thing is, yes, that's the goal for us, to experience contrast and bliss at the same time. But do we really even know what bliss is without the contrast of it?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting when you imagine, say, the masculine and feminine, it's fascinating to think of it as contrast, because very often we think of masculine and feminine as simply the male-female roles in a heteronormative society that we've always lived in. And the idea is to get along with as little contrast as possible, that we'll just separate everything out and you take care of the lawn and the garbage and the air quote manly things, and I'll take care of the soft things that require, whatever, emotional intelligence and blah, 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 blah. And we'll get along just fine. And we kind of imagine that this is sort of the masculine feminine harmony. But what that really is everyone's in the masculine. We've just separated chores out, right? True masculine feminine polarity that creates bliss is contrast. But it's not negative contrast. It's just like that. It's like if you have a darker backdrop for a white cake, you see the white cake better, and vice versa. Like you see it with more clarity. So let's say, for example, someone's grieving. So one of the classic masculine feminine dynamics is order and chaos. And unfortunately, in the past, if we're trying to minimize contrast, the person who likes the order will try to calm you down, get you lots of tissues, I don't know, pour you a drink, do something to kind of minimize the chaos you're feeling. And in the same way, if you're kind of a really expansive, creative person and you're married to someone who literally everything comes down to a spreadsheet, you are going to be constantly throwing stones in their road, trying to make them more chaotic, right? Because we think that the sameness creates more peace. But instead, imagine we lose someone really close to us. We are thrown into almost unfettered chaos. If we're lucky, we actually can go into those deep, deep emotional wells that are actually being triggered here. The best thing another person can do is come along and be pure order, pure structure. And what they do is they are the shoulder to cry on. They don't cry with us necessarily. They hold us while we cry. And the stronger they are, the deeper we know we're allowed to go, the crazier we're allowed to cry, the ugly crying and everything. And the other person, all they do is provide the contrast we need to go as deeply as we possibly can. And the wilder we go, the stronger they become. And the contrast gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they become so big and strong. We go so far and deep, we actually get to cry all the way out. And then at the end, we're completely tired and we sort of hold each other. And it is a kind of bliss. Like it's not like euphoric happiness bliss, but it's a kind of fully human experience bliss. And that's where the contrast is the magnetism that allows us to have these full human experiences. And obviously the same experience could be taken into something in sexual intimacy. It could be taken into something like raising children. It can be all the human experiences, but it's the contrast that allows for the huge experience. I've never thought of it in terms of contrast, and now that's all I can think of.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting that you say that, because I remember, so I was teaching at the time I was teaching journalism at this school, and we were actually doing a newspaper. So the kids were doing everything that was involved in creating a newspaper. So taking pictures, writing, planning, all that kind of stuff. And we were talking about pictures and how to get them. And I was trying to tell the kids, because we had, I don't remember what we printed it on, but it was a machine at the school. So it wasn't like super fancy or anything like that. So you had like a limitation of how minute your details could kind of be in a way. And I think I was also doing the yearbook at that time. And I was talking to the kids about how do you get a good picture. Again, we're going back to photography. And so I was pointing out things like, if they're wearing, whoever's in the group, if they're wearing, you see these things together, kind of separate them out so you can see them again to develop that contrast. And being in the southeast of the United States, sometimes you have to tread on, like, people, even my children, I mean, like, but a lot, children evolve through their understanding of bigger concepts. And so to say the word black down there, sometimes a very naive person will say, oh, that's racist or whatever, all this stuff. They'll just throw it out there. So felt like I had to tread, because I was dealing with middle schoolers. So I had to tread lightly. Like, okay, we just need to talk about the objectivity of this. That is the color white, and this is the color black. So if those two things are right, okay. So there was a student, this beautiful young lady, who was very, very dark, just had the darkest skin you could see. And she happened to have on a white t-shirt, flat out white t-shirt. And as we were talking about that, she definitely should have been in the picture. She was part of she was a leader kind of in this scenario. And so they take the picture, and I was so incredibly disappointed, because this picture was a really good picture. But the problem was with the camera as it was, she had this really bright white shirt and the lighting the way it was, and this really dark skin. I couldn't actually go into the computer and actually fix that. so that we could see her. It was like this bright white blob and this dark blob, right? And as you're talking about going into that extreme, that's kind of what it reminds me of. It's like pure one side, right? Pure brightness and pure darkness. And what I tend initially when you started talking, I was thinking, well, we tend to like try and not necessarily gravitate towards sameness, but a sense of balance. So when one person's got the light or whatever you want to call it, the yin and the yang, they've got one side of it, and the other person's got the other side. It seems like it really has to balance out in terms of whatever extreme they are, right? Like if one person can go to extreme of the feminine, then the other person can actually go to the extreme of the masculine. But it's knowing that you have that leeway to do that in a safe space where you really can experience the wholeness of being human.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Totally. And even what's beyond, like, I think one of the challenges is that we've lived these half lives. We've sort of applied a portion of ourselves to living because we've spent, 8 hours a day working and commuting and da 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 da. And we've actually not. I remember I love Thoreau, and one of the things that um, Henry David Thoreau, like what he wanted to prove to the world in the 1800s was that we weren't beginning to plumb the depths of the human experience because we were spending so much time, at the wheel kind of idea. And that is what I truly believe. And it's sort of like that sameness. It's like, imagine, say, a color wheel. And you think of the opposites on the color wheel and how that contrast is so appealing to our eyes. But it's almost like we've been raised to let's create the most muted versions of these. And, that's kind of comfortable. Yeah, that doesn't raise any feathers at all. We'll just do sort of the lightest yellow and the lightest whatever. And it's like, but what if we actually went into the deepest blues that we have? And then we would, like you said, then I get to go into I don't even know if blue and yellow are opposite.
Orange.
Nope. Okay.
Orange, yeah. Orange and blue. Yeah. And then yellow and purple. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yellow and purple. I love yellow and purple. Let's do that one. So imagine you start kind of deepening your color, like deepening your purple, and the other person's like, whoa, I can deepen my yellow. And that I think is the journey that we may start kind of a muted yellow, a muted purple, but then, and this is why it's so interesting in intimate relationships, that when we identify the polarity that we are strengthened in expanding. I was actually on a podcast yesterday, and the woman described being in the feminine as purring, as a cat purring. Mm-hmm. And as opposed to a dog barking or something kind of thing, right? And she said she had so many friends who had lost their purr because they'd had to be so masculine in life and all that. And so there are people, for example, male and female, who actually would love to expand their purr. It's almost like that. And it was the most, I'm still thinking about it, this idea of which polarity do I want to expand in? Mm-hmm. Well, for me, that vibration, that relaxation, that openness, that surrender, that expansion is for some reason what my soul wants to experience more of. And so to find someone who actually deeply wants to experience that divine masculine energy running through them, well, the more that masculine energy comes to me, the more my purr happens. And then they feel that vibration, which then brings in more energy and more energy. And then we start expanding out on that color wheel. But it's a very gradual thing. Like you don't jump to 100% because we're human and we're organic and we have a million moving parts that all, it's almost like one has to kind of get in line and then another one gets in line and you slowly do this thing. And what's beautiful is, say, for example, every time you make love or something, you kind of start where you left off because you knew that, well, that kind of worked. Mm-hmm. And you kind of go there and then you keep sort of trying. And it's really, really exciting.
It's like it's a dance. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious what you have to say. And I don't want to stay on this too long, but as you're talking about that, like one person adjusts a little, then the other person adjusts whatever way. You're kind of constantly finding that balance and the degree to which each of you is presenting at the moment. Again, okay, so one thing is this factor of time. That's I think at least for me, it's a little harder to wrap my head around. Not like from a knowingness, like that totally makes sense. But in terms of like the linear thinking that the human mind usually does, it's a little more difficult to kind of wrap your head around, like in what dimensions are we doing that? Take one direction for male, one direction for female. Now we have to go, vertical or and expand out the other way. But it's this going into that space without running up against somebody's I don't want to, this is not the right word, but it really is. I mean, this is the word that we use. I don't think it's a correct word, is issues. Like you become a little more masculine and then, or somebody becomes a little more masculine. The other person, do they feel more comfortable to go into the feminine, or do they get triggered by that masculine? Right. And then start to have a negative response. But again, over time, it feels like it really doesn't matter where you get triggered or how that adjustment occurs. It's more of like this experience of the range and always knowing that you can kind of go back to centered.
Well, and it also begins with a solid connection, right? It's sort of like that redefinition of love, to say that all relationships have to begin with agape. That is true trust, connection, respect for each other's journeys, like even admiration of each other, right? So then because then let's say you're playing in the masculine feminine dynamic of giving and receiving. So you're making love, and the one who wants to be in the masculine is touching the one that wants to be in the feminine. Well, for a lot of people who want to be in the feminine, they may have been handled rough in the past. They may have been abused. They may have had all kinds of experiences where they couldn't trust the person in charge. But because we begin with a trusting, loving relationship, the person who's giving starts to give, and the person receiving says, wow, this is hard right now. This is really triggering a memory, or it's triggering an emotion right now. And then the one giving slows down and says, do you want me to stop? Do you want me to keep going? And then the person who's receiving tunes in and says, no, keep going. I might cry, but that's okay. And then the one giving continues giving, and the person giving knows it's okay, because they're actually alive right now. Like, people often ask me about tantric healing, and it's like tantric healing happens in relationships. And I mean, if you're not in a relationship, and you can do it otherwise, but in a relationship, this is ultimate intimacy. To actually be able to be that vulnerable. For some people, it could be the person giving. And this is very, very hard, that they maybe have been criticized so much in their life, not even just in intimacy, but as a child. My first husband, he used to say that when he was growing up, that even if he did it right, he didn't do it fast enough. And that's a deep, deep training. So all of a sudden, the person giving is actually more afraid than the person receiving, because, well, I don't know. And the person receiving has the grace to say, just try, and if it feels good, I'll tell you. And if I feels wrong, I'll tell you, and we'll just shift gears. But it's not a grade. It's just an exploration, right? It's a trial and error thing. But that requires this loving connection, that the person giving knows that this person's still going to love them after, and they really are on an adventure together. And so the person giving is like, and they do something, and the person receiving makes sound, right? And suddenly, and maybe they stay right there for like 10 lovemaking sessions. And then maybe the next time the person's like, well, I had an idea. And the person receiving's like, let's try it. And it really, I really feel that because we've come out of so much conflict, and again, because we had it as children, especially at our age. Like, I'm 54. By this time, we have a lot of relationship experience behind us, positive and negative, painful and good. So it really does feel like baby steps. But the wild thing is, once we take those baby steps and we really like create the visceral memory of this positive experience, it's all good. Like it really, I don't know. And we really find, and I think that's where this harmony in conflict comes in, where, ooh, something's happening and it feels hard. And both people kind of take a deep breath and go, okay. So where's the harmony here? Not to fix it, but well, it is to fix it, but how do we ride this? How do we play with this so that everybody heals? And it's really beautiful. And it really bonds people.
I'd like to touch a little bit on something. I don't know if we recorded it or not, but you did say early on something that reminded me. It was like, we want to feel deeply connected, like you're talking about here, but we want to be deeply connected in the way that you said the way we know. Okay. Now, what I take from that is the way that our soul knows. So, for example, regardless of whatever anybody's experiences growing up, most of the time, if they're honest with themselves, if they're connected to their inner being in any way, they have a good feeling for what feels like a good relationship. Now, of course, that's all mixed in between with also our programming and what we've learned, right? But I find that the driving force behind people, especially when they're really connected with themselves, behind being able to either select or experience that like adjustment where it needs to adjust this way or it needs to adjust that way, comes from that knowing, which is, to me, doesn't even seem like it's a human knowing. It's more like this soul level awareness of what balance would be at any given moment.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. I have a vision of like water and water being like stuck in a jar. And if the jar just tipped over, the water would just do what it was naturally designed to do. Like it would just flow.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like us. It's like somehow we know, we just, like you said, on a soul level, we know that it's meant to be closer. And it's interesting because that's what our soul knows. But then we also have this personality that perhaps is affected by karma and samskaras and all these other patterns and habits that maybe we've experienced for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe we choose a relationship for its security. Maybe we don't even choose it for this kind of romantic bliss that I'm talking about. But even within that secure relationship, there's still something inside that says, well, I still want to be able to talk to you and I still want to be able to share. If we don't get it, we may still stay for the security and just give up on that for a time. Or maybe we stay with someone because we actually need to fight, right? I mean, sometimes
to go to the extreme.
We need a sparring partner. Like, like I remember when I was raised in a Christian home, grandparents as ministers, all that kind of thing, right? But I had struggles with the church. I had struggles with what was going on. And I found a good friend who I could fight with. When I moved out to the farm, I married a religious person and he had a huge religious community. And I found a friend who was a very, very critical thinker, and we would spar. Right? We don't spar anymore 25 years later, but we did in the beginning when we were younger. And sometimes we choose partners like that. We have it's almost like we have a strength inside we need to develop. And when we find someone and we fight with them, and for some reason it's what we're supposed to do. But even within that, we're seeking connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like seeking that connection. But then at some point, we stop choosing the fighters. We stop choosing people for security. We stop choosing people for all kind of these karmic reasons. And it's like we move into a dharmic relationship where we actually want to experience our soul's path. Like we actually don't want to experience the past patterns any longer. And then that's where I think a lot of us find ourselves going, well, then what? If I'm not here to win the fight, and I'm not here to provide security or get security, then where's the excitement? Where's the joy? And that's where we get to start playing in these more vulnerable spaces. Like we actually get to start, like for me, I've been teaching and studying Tantra for, decades. And yet every time I make love, I am amazed that I can surrender even more. And I can trust my intuition even more. And I can receive even more. Like there's still, and one time my partner, actually, we were just talking about this the other day. He said, do you think there's a ceiling? Do you think at some point we actually reach the ultimate thing? And I don't think so. I think it's like a forever thing, but there's no conflict in it. And except in that moment, you're making love or whatever. And you're like, and you just say, wow, I can release even more. And then suddenly tears come for some reason. And there's not even stories in them anymore. But yet, as you release, I don't know, maybe the liver releases, the nervous system relaxes a bit more, and you become that little bit more, I'm going to say orgasmic, but it's like on a subtle level, like crazy stuff. Like, because I know you want to know this. And so making love the other day, and I was in this completely released, relaxed state, and he was in the masculine, and I felt this urge or this vision. And I'm not a Reiki master or anything like that. Like I'm so heady, right? Like I am so I'm such a student more than anything. Like I'm not energetically sensitive like that. And all I knew was I was supposed to place my hands, kind of my fingers, by his hip bones and under his ribs. And I just placed my hands against, and suddenly he just like lit up and I lit up, and this subtle vibration and he suddenly just took this deep breath and went, oh, and the two of us were just like in this like suspended animation. And afterwards I kind of just stopped and he went, what was that? I said, no idea. I have no idea what that was. And I don't even think it's like some technique. I think it's just this, it's like the journey of discovering all of our bodies, our subtle bodies, our auric bodies, like all of what it is to be human. And I mean, I don't even know if I'll ever even try it again. Like it was the weirdest thing. It was just this, well, that was fun. And
Yeah.
I don't know, love making in life, it just becomes this exploration,
Yeah. Well, as you're talking about that, it's funny. I mean, everybody enjoys the conversations about sex, but if you really take that idea and then you can even easily, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, I know many people who are in very difficult relationships. And several of them, this is part of their path. Like some of it's karmic, but some of it is exactly what you're talking about. You're still seeing connection, but you also need on some level this experience to create the contrast so that you can go within yourself and really learn how to do that balance and the connection and so forth. And I kind of even see it in those situations where you're in a relationship, whether it be a romantic one or a friendship or a work relationship, where you're really just sensing what needs to happen. So if it's harmonious, of course, it feels like it's easier. If it's lacking harmony, it doesn't mean that you don't know to say something to somebody at a particular time, or you don't respond to somebody's doing something or saying something to you. But it's that dance between, this other entity. I mean, there's the idea of, everybody that we bring into our existence is a reflection of us. So these people who are experiencing these more contrasting relationships are experiencing that contrast within themselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that it's bad or good. I mean, of course, abuse is bad, right? Like we don't want to have that. But even in the most difficult times, like you were mentioning, grief, right? Or abuse of any kind, you still have that ability to go into that space where you're recognizing, oh, I'm on this side of it, or you're kind of going through that dance. But that what you're talking about there is like this knowingness of how to respond in a particular situation. When you're making love, it's really about the physical body. Like we're completely present in the physical body. But even if it's not really all about the physical body, maybe it's about our mind, or it's about our energy body, kind of knowing where to go in a room or with somebody else. It's still that dance of, what happens when I do this energy? Maybe I just want to play with it.
Well, it's like imagining driving cars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say you're a race car driver or something like that. The car is important. It's the cars actually racing, but there's a driver in the car who has choice and has interesting instincts and interesting experiences and interesting training and stuff like that. And that's like our bodies. Like our bodies are they're these amazing vessels where we can experience pleasure, pain, all kinds of things. But when we remember that we are, well, from a tantric perspective, to remember that we are also divine, like we are also really, truly incredible beings, that changes everything. And it's the same even in like an abusive relationship. Something funny happens there that obliterates our divinity. I don't attract abusive relationships. I've historically attracted neglectful relationships where, like, because again, I believe that, as I really started analyzing them and seeing them, I realized that was my own inner masculine that neglected me. I'll sort of throw myself in front of a truck, but not protect myself from whatever, and not show up for me and not do what needs, that kind of thing. But one time I was dating, I was married for 20 years and then I dated for about 8 years until my current relationship. And the weirdest thing is at one point I was traveling, I was over in Greece and I met a man on a dating app. And it was so curious because he was an abuser. Like he was like, I don't know if he was physically an abuser, but he would do these little things almost, I could feel it, to groom me. Like it was like I would I don't know, he was giving me I had been super anemic and gotten very, very skinny and like really skinny. Like, and I'm not a skinny person. And so I'd become very, very skinny. And he had said, well, I'll take you out for dinner and blah, blah, blah. And I said, that's great. I said, I'm really taking care to eat a lot of meat right now because I need to get my iron back up. I said, I'm trying to gain the weight back from becoming too thin. And so then like about an hour later, he's massaging me. He's massaging my legs and he says, yes, you certainly did store a lot of fat in your legs, didn't you? And I remember looking at him thinking, what a funny thing to say. And then, I would be typing, I'd be working because he stayed with me for a while and I'd be working on my computer. He'd say, wow, you type really quickly. And I say, yeah. And he says, not as fast as my friend though. And like, he would do these little tiny things to kind of just, but see, this isn't my pattern. So it didn't work on me. I kept looking at him thinking, what are you doing? But the weird thing is, there was something about him that made me powerless. And it was so curious because I'd never experienced that in this lifetime. Like it was like something was being brought forward because he actually was very mean and he was very controlling and very strange. And he had traveled quite a distance to come and stay with me. And I couldn't get rid of him. I couldn't find the words to say, you need to leave now. And I don't know why. And this is where it's very interesting when we are in abusive relationships or codependent or whatever, or with a narcissist or whatever those things are. It's very easy from the outside to say, oh, well, just say this. It's like, but it requires a lot of grace for ourselves to realize, to even be able to watch ourselves and say, why can't I get out of this? Why am I not making these choices? And so for me, this is where like Tantra, even yoga, these are historically spiritual disciplines. And this is where it's so important that spiritual means with God. with connection. We are not just animals. We actually do have this connection. And with this guy, for example, he drove me into deep prayer because I was literally watching this
Mm-hmm.
strange grooming that he was doing with me. And I was 50. Like I wasn't new. Like it wasn't like this was 4 years ago.
Yeah.
And eventually I was praying for help. I'm like, I need help. And eventually he said something so incredibly rude. I was finally able to say, now you need to leave. That was too much. And he argued and he freaked out and he lost his mind. But finally it snapped me out of that almost, it's not a brainwashing. It's just like you get lost in a spell or something.
Yeah.
And that's where it's really interesting. No matter what, like I remember even when I was divorcing my ex-husband, beautiful man, we were just on different paths. And I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want it to be more painful than it had to be. And I remember needing to talk about finances, needing to talk about, there's a fly on the camera. I needed to talk about this, and he was so devastated that he didn't want to get divorced. Every day I would wake up and I would just pray. I'm like, is today the day? Is today the day? And then when it was the day, it was like, okay, how do I open this up? And the words, to trust that the words would come. And that's where these really are spiritual practices, to find our way in the hard times, to ask for higher guidance, because then we say something we've never said before. And then we get to experience a pattern we've never experienced before. And then our partner's like, that's different. Like everyone acts differently. And that's what I think also helps find that harmony in the conflict.
Yeah. Your story reminded me of a relationship I had that it was also a new experience for me. Not the whole thing. It was just like you're talking about, that subtlety, the little parts that were different. And we reached a point in the relationship where I noticed that I didn't like the way that I felt when I was around him, and he was around all the time. He had moved in. And I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know why I didn't feel right. I certainly wasn't this, not my nature to say, oh, it's your fault. Like I'm not going to have this knee jerk reaction. So it took me a while to really figure it out. And it just got stronger and stronger. So that's the contrast we're talking about. Like the last words that the guy in Italy, I think you said Italy, said to you, right? Where you were like, okay, that's it. I'm done. It's over. I don't care what anything else is happening. And the same thing happened for me. It was like this feeling of this, like, I don't know what it is. And it was, I didn't have any direction. I didn't have any help. I had already heard everybody else's opinion of it, but I knew what, we had experienced together or what have you. And actually for me, it was the strangest thing because I'd never done this before, but I actually just typed in what I felt on the computer. Now, of course, this wouldn't have happened 30 years ago, right? But I just typed in some words and I got maybe a little hit here or there, but I just kept trying to figure out what that feeling was. And it came up, this information came up, and I was like, oh, there's a word for it. I didn't know there was a term for this thing. And it was what it was emotional manipulation. Okay. And it's not necessarily a judgment on anybody in particular, because what I read about it was, really everybody does it. It's just a matter of how do you use it, and have you taken it too far, and is it appropriate in a given situation or what have you. And so in that sense, I wasn't, there wasn't necessarily anything negative about it. I just knew that I didn't like it, and it was really interesting because that having the awareness and the words to be able to articulate, which is kind of the same thing you're talking about, where you just open up with your partner and say, okay, I'm a little uncomfortable here, right? It's the same thing. It's just bring it out to the surface and talk about it. It gave me the ability to have, because we were very mental, both of us were very mental at that point, have a conversation about this. Now, the conversation didn't go very well because emotions got involved, right? But that was okay because by then I had decided. But it's this unique ability to actually have those conversations. You get pushed to the point where you have to say something at a time that you're not used to. What I find for me, and I think it's true of everybody, is that like you're talking about being pushed to go inward. Like you were kind of pushed into, I have to pray until I get a solution to this, right? Um, if you don't go inward and you're constantly going outwards outside of you, then you don't get that clarity, don't get that flow of the words that need to come, or the knowingness of where to put your hands or where to move your body or whatever it is. And so like it seems like it's really just the foundation, just like you're talking about, yoga being the spiritual experience, because that is the thing that's driving, sitting in the driver's seat, right?
Totally. Well, it's interesting, like even another thing I'm really thinking a lot about these days is how important it is to be able to control our mind. This is like, if you, I was reading like Rudolf Steiner, and he was talking about like one of the 6 things that every human has to do is be able to control your mind. And it's interesting when we think about how we allow our mind to just go anywhere it wants. Like it's almost like there's wild horses in there and we have no idea where it's going to go next. And it's just going to take me down this rabbit hole. And then, this thing comes out of my mouth. And it's like our mind is fully within our control. It should be. And it's sort of like, and like one of the fascinations I have, like, right now is comparing our mind to a penis. Because in Tantra, for example, we talk a lot about, non-ejaculatory sex, and not in like classical Tantra, but in tantric intimacy. Because for many men, for most men, the penis is kind of this wild card, that it just could go off at any time, and it goes off too soon, or it doesn't go off, and whatever. And it's like all these things. And whether it's part of our cultural conditioning that sex is taboo and penises are bad and, all this kind of thing or whatever, but there's this disconnect that whereas in tantric intimacy, to really understand that, there's a lot of benefits to being able to actually have mastery over this, right? Because not only do you have mastery over it, energy can now flow through it freely without it. Like I keep having this picture of like a garden hose, like laying all over the place, that you actually are like, no, this is part of my body. And I have full mastery over it in the same way that I have mastery over my arm. But we are sort of trained that, oh, no, penises are crazy and you don't know what it's going to do, in the same way that we treat our mind.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But it's like to actually imagine that in every single moment, we get to choose what we think about. Because when you really think, where are these thoughts coming from? Are they even mine? Are they floating through the ethers? Are they thoughts from the neighbors? And sometimes we could have 12 channels running at any time. That's crazy. That is not ultimate human performance. So to even simply say, I'm going to choose my thoughts all the time. In relationship, this is huge. That because you're like, well, sometimes I just can't control myself. Who can't control yourself? Like, who's in the room right now? Who's lighting your fire? Who's speaking for you? And this is such an important thing to ask ourselves. And again, this is this journey of yoga, of tantra, of meditation. Why do we sit and meditate? Why is meditation part of all spiritual traditions? We have to be able to control our mind, and not in a negative way. That if I'm going to sit and think about nothing. And to actually, but only we can do it. Only we can actually go into our mind and see all the players. And we have to do it with our eyes closed. We have to do it in a contained environment where we're not interrupted, and actually say, wow, there is no stimuli right now. And my mind is going at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I need to find, the reins here. Like I need to understand how to sort this. Then imagine how different relationships are.
Yeah, as you're talking about that, I was thinking, okay, talking about controlling the mind, right? Control, typically the word itself by itself is usually associated with the masculine energy, but what you're describing here is controlling it from a feminine experience where you're not demanding that it does this or that. but you're creating a framework. I guess that's masculine. What would you say? Kind of like, because it seems to me like the mind, we could say the mind is very similar to the an entity within a relationship, in the sense that we think that it has this ability to go into chaos, or it has a ability to go to one extreme or another. And maybe we don't know how to manage it or how to deal with it. But the mind is contained in our, I mean, for lack of a better description, in our head, right? Like it's contained within our energy being, and it can't go outside of that. Um, so in a sense, that's like there's a container for the mind. So the mind can be seen, that chaotic energy can be seen as a feminine sort of like, where it has the room to grow. But let me see if I can explain this better. When you're in meditation and you notice that your mind is going crazy, or whatever you want to call it, who's noticing it? That's what, Michael Singer always says. Oh, how do you know? Like, who's watching it, right? Who is that thing? Okay, well, that's the bigger part of you that's stepping back and can see this existence happening, this chaotic mind or whatever. And you can do that in a relationship too. And I just want to add here a revelation I had after I didn't know what I was doing. Basically, I was doing spiritual work, healing after my first husband's death. And I had listened to a whole bunch of things. I'd done all kinds of things. And one day I was listening to something new. It happened to be Deepak Chopra. Not like I hadn't listened to him before. It's not like I didn't listen to other people, but he just said it in a way, and it just hit me at that moment, that thoughts are not reality, and you can just watch them come in and leave. They come in just like they leave. If you just sit there and wait, right? You just allow it to happen. You can actually take the time to actually observe what was happening. So I had a really unique, I say unique, it was really fertile environment in which that could happen, in that I was struggling with grief. And so I would have these, the water hose was just going crazy. Like all my mind was thinking about all these things that needed to be a certain way, what have you. And I had finally noticed, 5 minutes before I wasn't like that. 5 minutes before I was completely calm. Now this thing happened, and all of a sudden my mind is going somewhere. And all it took was one time. I just noticed it. I took a deep breath, and I realized, okay, I was fine before. I'm just going to let it go through. That's really interesting to watch it come in. Let's watch it leave. And it did. And as soon as I experienced that thing, I knew, boom, it's gone. I don't have to be at the mercy of the mind anymore. And that's, I'm just like, what you're talking about here reminds me so very much of, it feels like another person, like another energy in a relationship. And it's doing and behaving a certain way, but it still has like a container. It still has, and it's not, you can't control this other energy, but in a sense you can. You just do it in a passive way.
So imagine, it's a perfect example that when we think of the masculine and feminine, it's always healthy to think of them together, how they're working together, because we have a habit of, especially because of the patriarchal mindset, we kind of go, well, this is masculine and that's feminine and that kind of thing. But say in your scenario here, it was your healthy masculine creating the structure, creating the clarity, creating that container for your feminine emotions, truth, and everything to flow. And it was the balance of those two things that allowed you to come to completeness. And I think what happens is, because we do have, a lot of us have a great disconnection with our own inner masculine, because we've internalized the unhealthy, disconnected masculine outside of us. So, for example, we don't want anything, as you said, controlling our thoughts, because we're used to being controlled from the outside. That isn't for our benefit, it's for their manipulation. So it's almost like no one gets to control my thoughts. But there's real health in having a strong masculine clarity of mind that says, right now, I need to focus. Like let's say, for example, so I live in Canada. I live in a snow, Wow, I've lost the phrase. There's a lot of snow here. So snow belt. There are times in the winter when all of a sudden a blizzard kicks up and I cannot think about anything except driving on this road right now. All I can do is to make sure I am on the road right now. My masculine has to be acute and strong enough to obliterate all other sound so that I can focus on the chaos I'm trying to navigate. This is really important, right? There is a healthy masculine within that says, hold on a minute, where are these thoughts coming from? They're going to take me somewhere I don't want to go. This is all fear-mongering in my own head. These things aren't actually happening. This is healthy masculine, right? So that beautiful, healthy masculine saying, well, what is coming up for us right now in this moment? Oh, wow. Okay, let's look at that. Like, this is the beautiful communication between the masculine and feminine within us. And like you said, it often does feel like another entity because there's so much contrast between this absolute clarity and these emotions that are rising. But that's the bliss state. When we actually sit and we watch and say, wow, there's some big stuff coming up right now. It's okay. I've got you. Let's go there. Right? That's a really happy state.
Send inquiries, suggestions for new discussion topics, and comments to podcast@happylioncenter.com. That's podcast@happylioncenter.com. If you found this content enjoyable or helpful, please comment, like, share, and download. Donations are appreciated and help us to produce more of similar content. Consider making a contribution at the links in the description box. Your support is greatly appreciated. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Happy Lion Center and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. None of the content provided should be considered a substitute for legal, financial, medical, psychiatric advice or as care from a certified professional.